Hi there, I'm Victoria Peat, and in this video I'm going to show you how to make simple 4-patch blocks but using a strip piecing method. This method is great when you are looking to make lots and lots of 4-patch blocks. It really does save time. It also means that you don't have to cut out lots and lots of individual squares. This is an absolute bonus, particularly if you are working on a smaller scale. This is not the method to choose though if you're going for a scrappy look, because each of your 4-patch blocks will come out looking exactly the same. I am, however, going to show you two different versions of strip pieced sets, one using 2 colours and one using 3. So, are you ready to see how we strip piece 4-patch blocks? Let's go. So when making 4 patches from strip sets, you need 2 strips that are exactly the same width and ideally the same length. I've got 2 that are there or thereabouts. I'm going to be making an 8-inch finished 4-patch, and for that I'm going to be using 2 colours. So I've got 2 contrasting prints here. Well, one is a print, one is a background fabric, and they're 4.5 inches wide and approximately just over 20 inches long. So I'm going to place these right sides together and I'm going to sew along this long edge. On my machine I have my 1/4 inch foot. My needle's in the correct position for sewing a lovely accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm just going to sew all the way down one long edge, making sure that this seam allowance, these raw edges are matching all the way down. So once you've sewn all the way along that edge, you then need to press, which is always a challenge when you've got a small pressing surface. So I'll press that flat. Now you have 2 choices here. What we need to do next is we will then subcut these down into 4.5 inch sections. So you can either cut those now, or you can press with your seam allowances in one direction and then subcut those down into 4.5 inch sections. The challenge with pressing this way and then subcutting down is that sometimes when you're pressing a really long piece, and you might be doing the complete width of fabric, is that you accidentally press in little pleats. You're pressing away, but it's very easy, particularly if you're not pressing, so you're not folding back and pressing and holding the iron. If you're using more of an ironing motion, it's very easy just to let a little bit of fabric not get pushed totally over. It's very easy to do. You also, of course, need a slightly longer ruler to cut. So what you might find is that it's easier to subcut first and then press. So let's do that. I'll be cutting from this edge, but what I want to do is I just want to neaten up this edge first. I always start with a completely fresh edge. So I'll take a straight line on my ruler, place that on top of the raw edge at the top here, and just making sure that it's straight on the bottom as well. And just trim that off to make that lovely, nice and neat. I can then flip it back across, and then I'm going to subcut these down into 4.5 inch strips, because that's what I'm starting with here. We're 4.5 inch strips, so I'm going to subcut by the same amount. So I've got my straight line on my ruler going across the horizontal edge. I'm measuring that it's 4.5 inches down on this raw edge. I'm ignoring all the lines on the cutting mats, by the way, just using my ruler and my fabric. So I've subcut that into a 4.5 inch, and I'll work my way along. And how many you get from your strip set depends on how long you've cut it, but always measure your strip, the length of your strips, times it by the size of the squares that you're working with, plus add a little bit extra because you want to start off with a nice clean edge. So I just give myself a little bit of extra wriggle room. Okay, so I've subcut from that 4 squares, and then I'm going to press each of these. So you can see how this is a little bit easier than dealing with the long unwieldy piece, and you've just got a chance to be a little bit more accurate. But give both methods a try and see which method you prefer. That's what it's all about, is having options and trying out different methods and working out what works best for you. And do this last one. So from my strip that was just over 20 inches long, I've sewn those 2 strips together, and I've then subcut those into 4.5 inch squares, which I've then pressed open, and I've got myself 4 units. From this I'm going to make myself 2 4 patches. So we've got 4 units exactly the same. And if we deal with them in pairs, so this pair here, we'll just swap one round and we'll sew these 2 together. And on this pair, we'll do the same thing. So you can see how by having just 2 strips of fabric, we're creating 4 patches that are all going to be completely identical. So I'll place these right sides together, nest the seams in the middle, matching up these raw edges. Making sure this seam allowance that's facing away from me just goes underneath the presser foot, sits nice and flat. I'll sew those, and then I'll bring the next pair across. And if you're sewing multiple amounts, you can just keep chain piecing, keep feeding them through. I've got my seam allowances here just nesting nicely in the middle. You can see here. I've got just opposite fabrics on opposite sides, and the seam allowances, the ones on this top piece here are going this way, and the ones on the underside are going this way. Feed this next pair underneath the presser foot, and the feed dogs on the underside will just pick that fabric up and bring it through. Making sure that's nested nicely and hasn't shifted about. Pop those seam allowances underneath the presser foot. And that's our 4 patches done. We now need to press those. So I press that flat, and now I'm going to press my seams so that they swirl. So all my seams are going in the same clockwise direction. You can press them open if you prefer, or to one side, but I find I get a flatter, neater result if all my seam allowances are going in the same direction. The stitches in the middle here have just released nicely, so I can use the tip of my iron to get that flat. And then from the right side, I can just finish off those seams to create a lovely flat block. So there's one, and then we'll do the other one. Exactly the same thing. We're just going to swirl round. This one's coming on the right hand side is coming down, the one on the left is going up. Oh, that's come away really nicely. Sometimes the stitches need a little encouragement with your seam ripper. I don't rip the stitches, I just loosen them. Oh, that's lovely. And then from the right side, make sure it's all flat, give it a lovely press. So there we go, that's 2 blocks which will be 8 inches finished. They've been made from 4.5 inch strip sets, and by using just the 2 colours you'll be creating 4 patch blocks with 2 colours that are all exactly the same. When making 4 patch blocks using the strip set method, you will need 2 strips from one colour and then 1 strip each from your other 2 colours that you've selected. The length of your strip will depend on how many blocks you are making, but take the size of your block, your cut block. So for example, I'm making an 8 inch finished block here, and from that I need to work with 4.5 inch wide strips. So depending on how many I'm making, I'd take the 4.5 and I would times that by the number of blocks that I'm making, and then I'd add a little bit. So I'd need a 4.5 inch strip times however long for this one, 1 for this one, and then 2 for my other colour. So I have my strips cut out here. So I'll be making 2 pairings, each with the background fabric, right sides together, and I'm going to sew along this long edge and repeat with the other pairing. My machine is set up with a 1/4 inch foot and my needle is set in the correct position for an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. Sew down one long edge, making sure that the raw edges are matching. If you're happier pinning, do pin, but just make sure that you don't sew over your pins. I'm going to chain piece those, so I've left my needle in the down position and my next pair is ready to be fed underneath the presser foot, and it just gets caught by the feed dogs and pulled through the machine. I'm not pushing or pulling. Making sure the raw edges stay nice on top of each other. And take those out of the machine. So we have 2 strip sets ready to go. Yours might be an awful lot longer than this. I'm just going to press the seams flat. And what we need to do is we now need to both press these open and we need to cut them into smaller pieces so that we can sew those pairings together. Now you can either open out your strip set and press these open, but there are challenges with that when you come to a much longer piece. Sometimes it's easy to not press terribly well and you might end up with a little pleat in here, which will then reduce the overall size of the block that you're working with. The other option is to subcut down into the size of the units that you're after. So I'm going to do one of each. I will press this one. So I'll press that flat and then open. And I'm just pressing against the line of stitching. You find that if you press in an ironing fashion, that's when you have a tendency to accidentally press in that little pleat. So try and make sure that you're pressing in the direction that the seam allowances are going in. And press that flat. We're going to allow that to cool before we subcut that down into units. Your other option is to do it the other way round and to cut your piece into units and then press open. If you decide to do that way, I like to always just start with a nice fresh cut edge. So I flip that round so that I can cut, because I'm right-handed, so I can cut this edge. I'm ignoring the lines on the mat, and I'm taking a line on my ruler and placing that alongside a raw edge of my fabric, and I'm just making sure it's nice and straight here and straight here, and I'm just going to trim off this tiny little bit at the end, and that gives me, I've cut off just a tiny amount. That gives me a nice straight edge. From here I can swivel back round, so my stitching's at the top now, and I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to place a horizontal line along a horizontal at the top and the bottom, and I'm going to go across 4.5 inches because that's the size of the square I'm looking to cut. So I've got a line on that raw edge, a line on this one, and my 4.5 inch line is against this freshly cut edge on the side. So I subcut one, and then I'll do another 4.5, making sure this horizontal line is on a line on my ruler, 4.5 inches coming down, and I'm going to trim that off. So I've now subcut that into 2 units. I can now press those open. I'll bring this across here. Oh, sorry, I'm not going to press open, I'm going to press away. I'm going to press these towards the print. Oh, lost the stitching there, disappeared. So I'll leave those two to cool whilst I just subcut this unit. So I have already pressed this open. This was the other method. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to trim off this edge. My little square ruler isn't quite long enough, so I'll just use a slightly larger one. And I'm going to take a straight line on my ruler, and I'm going to place that on top of the seam line here, match it up here and here, to just try and make sure that I've got my ruler in a nice straight position and I'm not cutting at a wonky angle. So again, I'm just going to trim off just a tiny bit on this side. That gives me a nice straight edge to work with. Flip it back round, and then I'm going to subcut this into 4.5 inch rectangles. Move my pressing mat out of the way. So a straight line on the upper edge, straight line on the lower edge, and 4.5 inches running down this left-hand side. And a nice straight edge along the seam line. It's just those checks and balances just to make sure that you're cutting nice and straight, because the cutting is just as important as the sewing if you're looking for accurate blocks. So straight line, straight, straight and straight, and then I can trim. Okay, so those are the 2 different methods of how you can deal with your strip sets. Try both and just see which method works best for you. So from the first strip set, I've cut 2 rectangles, and for the second strip set, I've cut 2 rectangles. If you're working with that longer strip set, you may have 8 of these, 10 of these. It depends on the size of the squares you're working with and how many strip sets you've cut. Right, now to make the 3 colour 4 patches, you're going to take 1 from each strip set, and you're going to pair them together. But we're going to take them and make sure that you're swiveling so that you've got the prints on opposite sides. You can then place those right sides together, nesting the seam allowances here, matching up these raw edges. Then at the machine, you just sew along that one edge. Make sure your seam allowances are nesting. On the underside, if you've got this seam allowance on top coming towards you, the one underneath, because their nesting will be going away from you, just make sure that that stays going away from you as it gets to those feed dogs. It's not the end of the world if they get caught, but it does mean that your block just won't lie quite as flat. And then bring the next set in. Slide that underneath the presser foot, let the feed dogs do the work. Make sure that your seams are nesting down here. So you've got one seam allowance going one way and one the other. Raw edges are matching. Making sure that seam allowance is still facing in that direction, going under the presser foot. And there you've got your 2 4 patches. They just need a press. So then it's up to you how you would like to press your seams. You can press those open if you like, so one half of the seam allowance going this way and one half going the other way, or you can press them all in one direction, or you can use the swirl method where the seam allowance, you've got one here and one here. They're going in opposite directions, so you follow that direction and these go in opposite directions as well, but it's all going in this particular block, they're going in an anti-clockwise direction. So I'll just press this one a little bit up and this one a little bit down. Then when it comes to the middle, they're sewn together, but if you just release that stitching in the middle, sometimes it comes together nice and easily, sometimes you just need to encourage it. You can then just take the tip of your iron, get that right in the middle of the block. You can just see it creates a tiny little 4 patch, and then from the right side you can make sure it's all lying flat and then give it a nice press. Now I would normally, pardon me, I would normally have a go with my clapper and then I would leave the block before I move it, but we've got 2 to do here and I'd like to show you both, so I'll move that. So press that flat to warm up the stitching, and then my seams are going in an anti-clockwise direction. So I'm just going to press that one up, this one down. I'm going to release the stitches in the middle. Flip it over and give it a final press. And you can see how by nesting those seam allowances you create this really beautiful little point here where they match very nicely. So there you go. That is how you make 2 identical sets of 4 patches using 3 fabrics using the strip set method.
If you're looking for some other great ways of making 4-patch quilt blocks, then check out my videos. You can learn how to make 4-patch quilt blocks using the 1 at a time and the 2 at a time method. I also have a great video that looks more closely at swirling that centre seam so you can get a flutter quilt block. You can also check out the ultimate guide to 4-patch quilt blocks on the website. There's a real deep dive into layout styles, colour options and construction methods. There's a link in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to give the video a thumbs up, leave a comment or subscribe to my channel. See you next time.